Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you to all of you. I'm sorry, I'm a little hoarse. I was speaking. I did a talk this morning out of town, and so and I didn't have a microphone, but I'm a Methodist, so I had no trouble in making myself heard. When somebody says that somebody's an emeritus, of course, as you know, it's just an easy way of saying that I'm retired. And when somebody finds out that I taught at UT for over 40 years, and the first question they'll always ask is, have students changed? Now, some of my students are here. This is one of the best here, and there are lots of others. And the question is, have students changed? I want to just tell you one story, and we're going to edit this, are we not? This came at the end of my career. I was taking up term papers on the last day of class, and I closed the door and I said, all right, everybody pass your papers in. They did that, and I stacked them there, and I said, now, excuse me, now those are the papers that I'm going to grade. Every paper that has not come through this door will be penalized. Oh, the students were so proud of themselves that they got there on time. And so I started the class, and the door opened. And in comes a young man on crutches. Now, what would you do? Students, as you know, are like wolves. They run in packs. And so they were very interested to know what would I do. And I said, all right, all right. He tried to be here on time, but he just couldn't be as quick, as rapid as he normally is. So, sir, if you will put your paper on this pile, then you will be graded with the others with no penalty. The student smiled, the other students smiled, and I smiled. And I closed the door and started again. And the door opened. And in walked a young lady, and some student in the back said, limp, limp. So, have students changed? No. He said no. What I'd like to do this evening briefly is to share some thoughts I've had about Knoxville, more recent thoughts than I put in the book that I wrote in 2005. There is a shepherd in Grundy County who does not know that we are suffering through a major economic recession. But he is, I trust, the only person in the United States who does not know this. Not only is the United States going through this, but a good part of Western Europe and other parts are doing that as well. And I've heard a lot of talk in Washington, but I've never heard anybody really talk about what's really happening here. Not Republicans, not Democrats, and not Ts. Because I think what's happening is there are some major structural changes that are happening in the economy in the United States and in other parts as well. And those individuals, cities, states, or countries that can anticipate those structural changes and move with them, sort of like a surfer at the front of the wave rather than the back, they will be the winners. The losers will be those who have not changed and do not recognize and cannot move. I clipped out of the newspaper last week a list of United States cities with the highest poverty rates this is in 2010. Reading, Pennsylvania, Flint, Michigan, Bloomington, Indiana, Albany, Georgia, and on and on and on. These are the cities that had not changed, and they are caught at the back of the wave. Now, there's an old saying, an old adage that's used in horse racing. I'll get to Knoxville, don't worry. There's an old adage that's used in horse racing, and it's been picked up by NASCAR later, and that is, if you're going to win, you win in the turns. You don't win on the straightaway, but you win in the turns. And as you can anticipate as that turn is coming and you can position yourself to gain advantage, you will win. After the American Civil War, the United States was going through one of those major structural changes. Instead of most people being farmers or artisans or self-employed skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, etc., what was happening is that factories were springing up, and people were not self-employed. They were working for wages for somebody else, and that was new. That was new to this country. And what happened was that several of those industries began moving south, and those cities that could anticipate this structural change and move with it were cities that were going to attract that industry and be great cities. And Knoxville was one of those places. Let's look at what Knoxville had after the Civil War that made this so attractive for industries to come and be here. Number one, Knoxville was in Unionist territory during the war. And so investors from outside of the South did not feel bad in moving here. They were welcomed. That was not the case all over the South. In Macon, Georgia, Northerners were spit upon on the streets of Macon, not by Southern men, but by Southern women. We didn't even know y'all knew how to do that. But in fact that you did. And so people came to this city. The first president of the Chamber of Commerce after the war was a man born in Massachusetts who came down here because he was distantly related to the president of what was going to become the University of Tennessee. And when he died, somewhat after 1900, his casket was carried, half of them by people who had been here for decades, and half of them people who were new. All Knoxville knows of one of the most successful companies in this city, and that is the Albers Drug Company, a pharmaceutical company, one of the largest in the South. The original name of that company was Sanford, Chamberlain, and Albers. Sanford, a native of Connecticut, Chamberlain, and Albers, natives of Ohio. And if one looks across the economic landscape, we will see that those factories, those businesses were created by these people. The Knoxville Iron Company, Ohio, the Dixie Cement Company, Knoxville Knoxville Sevierville and Eastern Railway. That was, I think, a person from Illinois, and many others. I was at a local country club quite some time ago, and I should never have said this, but sometimes I just can't stop myself. I said if you look back far enough in your genealogy, you'll find something worse than an illegitimate child or a horse thief. You're going to find a Yankee. Well, two women had to leave the room. They were visibly upset. And one woman said, "He's talking about Granddad," which indeed I was. These people brought dynamism, they brought energy, and they brought capital. The second thing that one could list of why Knoxville is going to be in front of the wave is the railroad. Knoxville had never been a river city, not until TVA could you really navigate the Tennessee River. We have photographs, pre-TVA photographs, of people literally walking across the Tennessee River right around the downtown area. It was so dry. But when the railroad came in 1858, and after the great unpleasantness was over, that railroad allowed goods to be manufactured in the Northeast and the Midwest and shipped in here by rail and sold in wholesaling houses in Knoxville and into the general stores of East Tennessee. Now, one of the things that always irritated me when I was working is occasionally a student would raise his or her hand and would say, "Is that really true?" Now, what do you think I'm supposed to be doing here? In 1896, the third largest wholesaling center in the entire South, in terms of dollar volume, was Knoxville, Tennessee. The first was New Orleans. The second was Atlanta. And the third was Knoxville. That was, and also, because we had the resources, the coal, the iron, we could produce factories of our own. Between 1880 and 1885, over 90 new factories that employed more than 50 people were set up in this city. The one that we remember is the Dempster Brothers Machine Shop that made heavy road equipment. I think they did some work on the Panama Canal. But then, of course, later the garbage removal equipment. But there were many, many companies like that. Great manufacturing and commercial center. The other thing that you would need is labor, and the labor was here. From the rural areas of East Tennessee, from the counties surrounding Knox, there came people to work along Jackson Avenue in the commercial houses, for the railroad, in the railroad repair shops, for the manufacturing. And what was so interesting is these people were white and they were African American. African Americans, once the Union Army had taken control of Knoxville in 1863, African Americans abandoned the farms, and there were a few plantations, and they came into Knoxville looking for freedom and opportunity, and it was here. The Knoxville Iron Company hired black and white workers side by side for equal wages. So did the phone company when telephones came, and did the city when it was doing paving of the streets, etc. In 1880, the population of Knoxville was 1/3 African American. Is that really true? It is absolutely true. And in 1894, the voting population, which would be adult males, was 36% African American. Now, don't let me say that this was a Garden of Eden. It wasn't. It was a segregated society. But in the African American communities, and there was more than one, there were people who were remarkably well off, and people who were quite modest. Business leaders who serviced that African American population, theater owners, restaurant owners, grocery owners, etc. And they were here. And we have examples of city councilmen, Board of Education members, fire department captains, directors of post offices who were African Americans. This is not as one might think so usual in this city. And so the capital was here, the transportation was here, the resources were here, and the labor was here. I want to read to you briefly something from, and this is not, by the way, from the Chamber of Commerce. It is from a newspaper in Richmond, Virginia, in 1871. And that newspaper wrote, "No city of the South except Atlanta has improved more rapidly since the war than had Knoxville, Tennessee. No city in the South except Atlanta has improved more rapidly since the war than Knoxville, Tennessee. That is quite a statement. And just after 1900, an investors magazine in New York talked about where one should invest one's money, not stocks or bonds or and I think Warren Buffett was only in grade school in 1905, but where geographically. Number one on the list was Knoxville. Knoxville was going to be the place that was going to burgeon. The new Atlanta, the new Pittsburgh, with a little luck, the new Chicago. That magazine called Knoxville the new jewel in the crown of the New South. Oh, we were proud. We were very proud. Now at this point, I need to take a quick break, and I want to make it quite clear. There's no olive in this, not at all. So I know, shucks yourself, because you have a question, and wherever I go, the question is always the same. What happened? Now, some of you say, thank goodness Knoxville is not the new Atlanta, the new Pittsburgh, the new etc. And I must concur. But I guess the question is, what happened to Knoxville? Well, let me sum it up in two very quick points. That the structure of the economy was beginning to change again. And the leaders who had built this town, the people who had come from all over, but a lot from New England and upper Midwest, those people had, for the most part, passed away. And their sons and their grandsons, daughters and granddaughters, were not as dynamic, were not as welcoming to new people. And instead of trying to encourage newer industry to come, they tried to keep it out so that one would not have to compete with the labor pool or the dreaded U word, unions. Eek. One example will do. The Knoxville Woolen Mills was one of the largest woolen manufacturers of clothing in the United States. It had commission agents that sold in Chicago, New York, and actually you could find Knoxville Woolen Mills goods sold in Europe. In 1911, that business was broke and sold at public auction. What had happened? Instead of investing money in the new machinery that would keep the quality of the goods up, and new designs that would make people want to buy more clothing, the directors of that company simply took the money out and didn't reinvest it. And so the quality of the goods went down, and the designs were old-fashioned. And one commission agent said, I can't sell this stuff. The quality's bad, the designs are old. But in the meantime, the directors had taken out of that company each year an average of 14% on their investment, and some years as high as 40%. Who were they? Listen. Sanford, Chamberlain, Albers, Tyson, McClung, McGee, the sons and grandsons of those dynamic founders. And by the way, my job is not to insult anybody unintentionally. And if there is a person from that family here, I will apologize privately and publicly, but I will stand by what was said. The leaders did not anticipate, or would not, that this new wave was coming. And they should be on their surfboard and out ahead of it. The second thing that happened was, I guess, more painful in some ways. Many of you know that I live in Sevier County, which is a rural county south and east of Knoxville, and very, very happy there. In 1900, Sevier County raised corn, wheat, and cattle. Tobacco had not come to Sevier County, and I'm going to guess that tobacco will not be long for Sevier County. The small farmers are being bought out of their allotments by the government. And nowadays, the largest agricultural crop in Sevier County is illegal. But now we're going to edit that out, aren't we? But in 1900, what Sevier County and Union and Jefferson and Koch and Roane really raised was children. Enormous family sizes, larger than almost any families in the state and of many families in the United States, in spite of the fact that the infant mortality rate in these counties, for the only year that we have good statistics, exceeded that of modern-day Pakistan. In Sevier County in 1882, 29% of all the deaths recorded were children who failed to reach the age of 1. That's those little lambs that are out on those little tombstones in those country cemeteries. And 56% of the deaths were people who had not reached 21. And just for fun, since I've exceeded this, the oldest person in 1882 in Sevier County who died was 65. Wow. Average life expectancy, 44. But there were only so many ways that those farms could be divided up. In 1860, Sevier County had 900 farms. In 1900, it had 3,000 farms with no increase in acreage. They're trying to divide it up amongst all the sons. The daughters got personal property, dishes, or money. And there was only so far up the ridges and into the coves that we could farm. I know the jokes that people tell about the short-legged cows and harvesting potatoes and rolling them down the hills into the sacks. But in point of fact, these people had to leave, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And they came to the only place of refuge, and it was Knoxville. And they got jobs at the railroad. They got jobs in those factories, in those commercial houses. But they brought with them an attitude that changed Knoxville in many ways. The first thing they brought was an attitude about government. People in those counties then, and many now, believe that government is only there to serve one purpose, and that is to pick your pocket. And the answer is never vote for a tax increase, no matter what. Now, there was a native of my county who, born in Sevier County, went to Kentucky, worked in the mines, came back and started opening grocery stores, then went into politics. And this man, who dominated Knoxville politics from 1939 to the early 1970s, ran on one issue alone: for lower taxes, vote for and elect Kaz Walker. And there it was. What does that mean for public education? What does it mean for infrastructure? What does it mean for the other things that are necessary to make a city a city? Second, these people brought with them attitudes about race that were not productive. In the rural areas, separated by geography, maybe people had gotten along. But here in the city, close together, it was different. And there was a race riot in 1919. Much larger than almost any historian has written about, much larger. In the early 1920s, the largest per capita Ku Klux Klan chapter of any city, South or North. And in the 1930s, unemployed whites went to the phone company, the city government, the iron company, and said, you have African Americans, not the noun they used, who are working and we are unemployed, fire them. And many did. And those communities did not collapse, although it's kind of a mystery to me in some ways why, but they went to their knees, and many left. The percentage of African Americans who live in Knoxville now is about, I'm guessing, what, about 17%? Lower? 12%? Well, that goes from the third in 1896 to about 12% now. And then after the Second World War, things began to get seriously out of joint because that structural change now had taken place. And the industries that Knoxville was going to need for its future, many of them were not here because they'd been kept out. Electronics, petrochemical, later communications, all of these things, and they simply were not here. And the industries that we had depended on, textiles, clothing, iron, railroads, they were all sick. Foreign competition for many of them, off and on bad management for some of the others. One mayor of this city had a wonderful idea. He was approached by a company that was going to bring 4,000 new jobs to this city. And what that company wanted, and by the way, any of the 8 cities that you're touring would have given this easily for 4,000 jobs. They wanted the city to buy some real estate and give it to the company, to set up the utilities and the roads and give that to the company, and have a tax break for so many years, and then they would start paying taxes. But the taxes were going to be paid by the wage earners who were coming in. That idea was floated in as a bond issue, and it was opposed by the Knoxville Chamber of Commerce. The people paid to bring industry were trying to keep it out. And the executive director of that chamber told Mayor Duncan, and he told me this before he died, that a 9% unemployment rate was good because it made workers loyal, which is absolutely true. I would be just as loyal as I could be if I knew that there were all those people out there waiting for my job. With the decline of the railroads, by the way, how many of you, not counting Amtrak, have ever ridden on a passenger train? Good. Well, that's a larger group than when I talked this morning. It was what, under a third, and there was I was talking yesterday to a group, and there was only one who had ever ridden on a passenger train. Now, after 1956, if your city was on an interstate highway, then it had a chance to make it, because that would be the new railroad. And companies that simply did not exist, these major trucking companies, were coming up onto line. Now, I know when you're driving on the interstate, you're a little bit afraid of these people, but they're fine. They're the artery that's really transfusing the economy. But as a Republican island in a state normally run by Democrats, Knoxville wasn't going to get interstate highways. A group of Knoxville business leaders, and Don Mertz was one of those leaders and told me this before he passed away, went over to beg Democratic Governor Frank Clement for highways, and Clement told them, and I quote, "When you people learn to vote right, you'll get your roads." Well, we never did learn to vote right, did we? But we did have 2 Republican governors, and we did have a World's Fair, and we did have a terrible bus car accident up on Highway 11. And Knoxville finally completed its national interstate network in 1984. Well, there's no use in rushing these things. I mean, it could be like beta or it's, you know, something that simply was going to go away. Now, one of those changes is going to take place. Another, and you know it. You can sense it. You can almost smell it. That there's a new structural wave coming. And the question is, where is Knoxville? Is it ahead of the wave or is it behind? Let me say this in its favor. Knoxville's political leadership is far more dynamic and far more welcoming of new people and new industries than it's ever been since just after the Civil War. And the political infighting that had happened for some years is almost gone. There are new people coming in here, and they are welcomed in numbers, sometimes for the first time. Some years ago, I picked up this statistic. In Cedar Bluff Elementary School, there were more young people born in India than born in Knox County. And those people who are coming there they are physicians, they are scientists who work at Oak Ridge, they are people who work at the university. They are good citizens. And that's happening. And the communications companies are coming. I had a student who came to see me some years ago, and he said, "Oh, doctor," he said, I don't know whether, I've had an offer from a new company in Knoxville that was making historical documentaries. And I don't know whether to go with that company or to finish my dissertation." And I said, "Well, to tell you the truth, Michael, my life has been wonderful doing what I'm doing, but you have to make that choice." And he said, "Thank you." And he chose Jupiter Entertainment, which is one of the major. You look in the History Channel, and they're all over the place. And old companies have learned, unlike old dogs, old companies have learned new tricks. John H. Daniel, and many of you know, it's an individually tailored suits that are here. Those suits today are sold all over the United States and in parts of Europe. You can tell. The tailors that make those suits are in Turkey because John H. Daniel can't find tailors in this region. And so they have to stay here, they have adapted. And that is the future. I was talking to a Rotary Club some years ago, and it was a luncheon meeting, and I said, now what I'm going to say is it may be a bit controversial. And one of the Rotarians said, "We don't care what you say, just finish by 1 o'clock." But what I wanted to tell them is this wave is coming. And this city, and by the way, I do not belong to the Chamber of Commerce. This city can do that. Now, one more story about why I'm glad I retired. And this is going to be edited for sure. I was teaching a course, Western Civilization course. And I had an examination, and the students were required to write an essay on the medieval church. And one of the students, a very fine young woman, wanted to write that the medieval clergy was expected to remain celibate And she did know that celibate meant without sex. But she couldn't spell the word. She'd never actually seen it. Now, if you don't believe this, I have a Xerox copy in my office, because what she wrote was, the medieval clergy was expected to remain celibate, and she did misspell it. But afterwards, in parentheses, she wrote, I can't spell without sex. Have students changed? You have been very kind. Tom has asked me to remind you that there are books. The Knoxville books are discounted and for sale. And my wife Linda wants to remind you that we are on fixed incomes. So thank you very much. And there are questions and criticisms. My ego is just strong enough. So, questions or criticisms? Oh, thank you. Oh, there's a microphone back here. They would like you to use the microphone. Well, you can bring it up to him if you want to, but he's... recording it. This man led, or was one of the leaders of this civil rights movement in this city. I'm sorry?
And in terms of his impact upon the city of Knoxville, what impact do you think that the butchers had on Knoxville in terms of accelerating change in Knoxville and the demise? Did that set things back in terms of the course that had been set as a result of their leadership?
So the question is the impact that the butchers had on Knoxville. Now for filling in a little bit, the Butcher brothers at one time controlled two banking empires. And you can see it if you walk down Gay Street a little bit. One of those towers is one of the brothers, and one of the towers is the other. They brought a kind of a new energy and dynamism. At one time, one of those banks wrote half of the business loans in the city. And they were remarkably innovative, and people were excited. And then there was the World's Fair that they, in part, were able to bring here. But after the fair, immediately after the fair, federal investigators moved in and found that there had been major bank fraud, and those two banks collapsed. I was in Chattanooga working on another book, and I read about the collapse of the Butcher Empire, and I had just written the end of the first edition of this book, where the butchers were the heroes. And so I called back to the editor, and I said, we got to change the ending. And she said, well, we can change the ending. It will cost you $1 a word. And then she said, no, we'll change it. You guys look like idiots. It turned out, Mr. Rawls, it turned out that the real damage was really psychological. Not so much, now there were people who lost money. There were people who were gambling and went broke. There were suicides and attempted suicides. And there were others who went to prison. But the damage for the town itself, the larger community, really was in our minds. We had been so defensive about what people had said about us. John Gunther in the mid-1940s called this an ugly city, unfair, I think. He hadn't been to a lot of cities I've been to. Knoxville was the last city in the United States to still prohibit Sunday movies. And now I know that doesn't mean much to people, except without the ticket prices for Sunday movies, Knoxville wasn't going to get those films right away. And so you could look in the Nashville paper or the Chattanooga paper or the Memphis paper, and you'd see a movie coming out and realize it wasn't going to get to Knoxville for a week or two. One person wrote to the News Sentinel, he said, I hope the 7 dwarfs do not grow old and die before Snow White finally comes to Knoxville. The damage wasn't real, the movies weren't any better or any worse, but it was the psychological damage of being behind. And we weren't behind, and we aren't, but we had that feeling. Our daughter went to do graduate work at MIT, and she called home and she said, you know, I can compete with these people at Brown and Harvard and MIT and Columbia. I said, well, who said you couldn't? And she said, well, I always kind of thought that we were a little bit behind. And she says, and also all that orange, it just blinded me. So there was damage, and it took a long time to get over it, but the damage really, I think, was mental. We had to start risking again, which we are. Here's another question.
Thank you, Dr. Wheeler. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that Knoxville was a leading city in the rebirth of the New South. Having grown up in Mobile, Alabama, I know Mobile is in the South. But living in Knoxville the last couple of years, I have friends that argue with me as to whether Knoxville is in the South or whether Knoxville is in the North. What is your
Where are these questions coming from? This is hard stuff. I mean, what I'm used to getting is this going to be on the test? I've been to Mobile, and in fact, my favorite clothing store is in Mobile. I would love to go there. But no, Knoxville is not a southern city. It fools you because of our accents, i.e. the mayor. Or it fools you because of the music we listen to, or some of the other things that we do, or the amount of the number of people carrying lethal weapons and things like that. But really, Knoxville is, and I thought a lot about the title for this, or the subtitle, and I subtitled it "A Mountain City in the New South." It's a mountain city. You want a southern city? Go to Chattanooga. That's a southern city. You can tell. You want a southern city? Go to Nashville. Not as much now as it was, or Memphis. But no, Knoxville's not a southern city. If anything, it's a mountain city infused with the dynamic transfusion of outsiders, many of whom do not come from the South. Now, let me correct that in one sense. We have letters upstairs in the McClung collection from African Americans who write to relatives in the Deep South and say, come up here. And we have voting records in the 1920s. And the voting records require name, age, and birthplace. And so we know that a lot of these men and women were coming out of the Deep South, and we're settling here. Many stayed, many continued on in the 40s and 50s. So I would have to say, no, not in the sense of Mobile. Knoxvillians do not think about themselves in that way. There's an old story, well, I shouldn't even tell this. You're editing this? It's about a civil rights worker, not you, sir, who passed away and went to meet St. Peter. And he said, I have important work to do. Can I have more time? And St. Peter said, I'll have to check. So he went back, and he came back, and he said, God said that you could have more time, but God will send you to Mississippi. And the civil rights worker said, "Will God go with me to Mississippi?" And St. Peter said, "God said he'd go as far as Memphis." Comments or questions? There's one.
Dr. Wheeler, how could you explain to us in quick terms how the Civil War all the way through World War II affected the growth of Knoxville?
By the way, since we've known each other for years, you know I can't do anything in quick terms. The Civil War in Knoxville is a particularly painful situation because here's a city that was really occupied by two armies for probably almost the entire war. And that was very difficult. Up to 1863, the Confederates occupied, and it was a hard occupation. And then after 1863, the United States Army, which my students insist on calling the North, came and occupied, and it was painful. But I've actually argued in one place, and I think somebody has this on tape, so I can't deny it, that the Civil War was actually good for Knoxville in many ways, because the people who I mentioned, Perez Dickinson in the Chamber of Commerce, William Chamberlain, these people, they knew about Knoxville and Sanford because they'd been here. They served here, and after they mustered out, they came back here. And the fact that it was Union gave us a great advantage. I've just finished reviewing a very good book done by UT Press on the history of Lincoln Memorial University. And if you'd like to know something about it, it's a whale of a good book. But that university was founded in the 1890s by Northern philanthropists who were going to come and they were going to help the poor folks of East Tennessee. And maybe it was a little bit condescending, or more than a little, but at least their hearts were in the right place. And that had come, and the name had come from the idea that Lincoln said, we have to do something for these Unionists in East Tennessee. And that's how the university really got its name. In terms of the other wars, we are the volunteers. In World War II, and I'll skip some of the World War II, women for the first time in this city worked at jobs that they had never been allowed to work at before. Security guards for TVA were women packing heat. No German's going to fool with that. And they were making money. They were contributing. Now the unfortunate thing is when the war was over and the men came back, they wanted their jobs back, and many of the companies fired those women and gave the jobs back to men. I would claim, without any proof at all, that might for some women have been the origin of the women's movement that came about 15 years later or so. One more, and then. And here it is.
Hi, Dr. Wheeler. I'm a little curious. You just mentioned women at TVA, but what role do you think TVA more broadly played in the city's development?
Great question. And then I'll answer one you didn't ask. TVA brought in $7 billion to the Tennessee Valley. It brought in people. None of the lieutenants and up at TVA. One, I take it back, was from the South. These were people who all came in. The talent that they brought, and the fact that their mission that President Roosevelt has given them is a navigable river, a modern agriculture, and jobs. And so there was going to be the attraction of industries and others. Now, sometimes TVA did things without checking with the people that it was claiming to help. And that's when it got in trouble. And sometimes TVA didn't always tell the truth about some of the things that we're doing. But by and large, it was it was a remarkable, almost revolutionary experience. Now, the question you didn't ask is, then what role did the university play? The University of Tennessee, because its appropriations came regularly from the state legislature, was in and of itself, I think, more timid than it perhaps should have been. It should have led in many of the issues that we're talking about, not political issues, but economic issues, education and other things. But it didn't. There were several faculty members in 1923 who were fired. They claimed for teaching evolution. I'm not sure that was the case. And the president of the university brought all the deans together. He said, I'm going to fire these people. While I'm at it, do you have any other people you want me to fire? And all of their hands went up. They had the idea being, and by the way, the only person I know should have been fired is a woman who refused to teach the course that she was hired to teach. That is a dismissible offense. But until fairly recently, the university's been pretty timid about it. It's been, when I came here in 1970, the term was, well, you'll be Knoxvilleized, which I don't think is fair. And it's not fair now. The university is a very, very different animal from what it was in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. One more. This is a man who we go together and speak very often, and I tell the people who organize it, I get to speak first because I will not follow him. He's very good. He does a history of Oak Ridge that's absolutely superb.
You're too kind. I would like you to speak just a moment about the impact of the Manhattan Project and Oak Ridge on Knoxville.
Well, it's a sort of a plus and a minus. There was this city, as they say, the book city behind the fence, and it brought in talent. It brought in world-class people, many of whom stayed after the fence came down. But the two cities didn't get along very well. Knoxville was always convinced that Oak Ridgers were getting things that they didn't get, like beer, or new tires during the war when tires were rationed, there was a fair amount of hard feeling at first, and when Oak Ridgers came to town. Because the streets in Oak Ridge were not always paved, they came with mud on their shoes, so they were easily identifiable. And apparently were not welcome. And they also criticized Knoxville. Knoxville didn't have Sunday movies, didn't have Sunday baseball. Actually, it had Sunday movies. The city ordinance said if it was a religious movie, you could show it on Sunday afternoon. And the manager of the Tennessee Theater across the street was arrested because he had shown Robin Hood with Errol Flynn. And his defense was, well, Friar Tuck is in the movie, but that wasn't going to do. And so Oak Ridgers complained. Well, we come to Knoxville and there's no baseball games to go to. There's no movies to go to. And then there's the response. Well, we have our churches to go to, and you can go there. And then the response is, well, we're not welcome in those. And finally, the editor of the New Sentinel said, we're not accepting any more letters. Things are better now. And partly the reason they're better is that a lot of people who work in Oak Ridge live in West Knox County. And that's a great thing. And a lot of people who work at the university live in Oak Ridge. And they like that because they believe that the schools are quite good for their kids. And so it's really become one city in a sense, and certainly better than it was. In fact, if I had to title this talk, I would have to say the title of this talk was Knoxville, Tennessee, Better Than It Was. George Washington, halfway through his farewell address, said, "Here, perhaps I ought to stop." And he didn't, but I just did. Thank you.